Hi everyone, this is Professor Casey. Welcome to History 1302. Today we're beginning with our first chapter for History 1302. This is chapter 16, the era of Reconstruction, and this is adapted from David Emory Shi's America, A Narrative History. This is our textbook for the class. And what we're talking about with this first chapter is something that has a little bit of overlap with History 1301. Okay, if you've had 1301 already, you'll know that most instructors will at least get to the end of the Civil War, if nothing else, and sometimes they'll be able to push all the way to the end of Reconstruction. Okay, so you might see a little bit of overlap here if you've already had History 1301. So what we begin with here in Reconstruction is the period that lasts from the very end of the Civil War, around 1865, until roughly the year 1877, when Reconstruction actually ends. Okay, and this is a very turbulent time for the country because up until the end of the Civil War, we've had a country that's been completely divided over ideas, over economies, over just about everything you can possibly imagine. Okay, and what we're going through now is the period of trying to rebuild and reunite the country, and especially even more difficult so because now we've had the Emancipation Proclamation, and throughout the course of Reconstruction we have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, all of which give certain rights to African Americans now, many of whom have been now completely released from slavery. But again, this is still a very turbulent time period, and just because individuals might be emancipated, it doesn't give them any kind of protection from the federal government, although the government does attempt to do that over the course of this whole thing. Main thing to keep in mind here is when it comes to trying to reabsorb the Confederacy into the Southern economy, or reabsorb the Southern economy into the Union, that is, the Confederacy has been completely annihilated here. Okay, the entire Southern economy has been completely devastated by everything that's happened during the war, both in terms of infrastructure, right? All the buildings. You see here in the background, this is an entire munitions facility, right? These are cannonballs that are kind of piled up in pyramids in the background. And you see all the buildings, the devastation and everything. Obviously, there's no kind of modern construction equipment to rebuild all this, to clean it up. People had to do all this by hand. So this is a very long and arduous process. The plantation system, for one thing, has been completely destroyed as well. Okay, the South's entire economy before the Civil War was based in the cotton industry. Okay, from the War of 1812 all the way up until 1865, that's what the South did for the country. Okay, and now that the plantation system has been destroyed, slavery has been abolished, everything has essentially gone in the tank. Okay. To say that there were any good racial relations in the South between blacks and whites is a stretch. Okay, there were a few free persons of color that did live in the South during this time period, but by and large, most of the relationships between whites and blacks was essentially one between slave owners and the slaves themselves. Okay, so any and all attempts to have some kind of status quo, for better or worse, quite often for worse, all that has essentially collapsed, and things have gotten much more tense and much more hostile, and continue to do so over the next few years. Now what the federal government has decided to do is to try to plan what it refers to as Reconstruction. Okay, and Reconstruction is the idea of, number one, trying to rebuild the South's infrastructure, trying to clean up the mess caused by the war. Obviously, the North and the South want to reunite politically. The North wants the South to be reabsorbed back into the Union. And the South is not always going to be compliant about this, right? They don't always have the intention of wanting to be part of the Union again. Okay, there's still plenty of sour grapes among Southerners about all of this, about the war. Many of them still believe the war is still going on for them, right? They're not content with what the North has done. And of course, now that we have so many individuals who have been emancipated, everybody who is a person of color is now legally considered by the federal government to be a free person of color, right? Now there is a transition period where we have individuals who have been slaves their entire lives, many of them for several generations of their families. Now they're being considered as free, and the rest of the country has to decide, essentially, has to decide for them, unfortunately, how they're going to be viewed by society, how they're going to be reabsorbed into society and whatever relations are going to happen, good or bad. And as I said before, the South has no guarantee of complying with any of this. Okay, for most of the South, the Civil War was a romantic lost cause. Right? It's not something that a lot of former Confederates regret doing. Many of them think that this was something that was morally the right thing. They had this idea in their head this entire time that slavery was somehow morally superior, that they were doing blacks a favor somehow by allowing slavery to continue. It's this idea of what is called benevolent paternalism, right? It's kind of it's a very patronizing way of looking at things, obviously, but this was the idea of Southerners at the time, that this was something that was good, and now the North is coming in and is trying to remodel everything. And of course, Southern planters, because they have this idea of benevolent paternalism, they believe that somehow blacks are inferior to the rest of the country, that they're somehow incapable of handling freedom, of handling self-sufficiency, that somehow they need whites somehow to do for them. Okay, and in reality, it's actually the other way around, right? So many Southern whites during this time period, the slave owners, have relied on slaves to allow their economy to continue. If they are wealthy Southern slave owners, if they have several dozens or even hundreds of slaves, most often they can't even get dressed in the morning without some sort of assistance from a servant, a slave, etc. Okay, so that's really kind of hypocritical in this way. And now, for the very first time, the federal government is now coming into this and saying that we need to be the ones to step in and ensure that everyone's civil rights are going to be guaranteed. Okay, and this is something that the federal government has never attempted before, right? The government hasn't been big enough to do this. Okay, so this is it's a big transition period, not just for society, but for the government itself. And now a lot of Northerners are even out for blood in this case. Many of them insist that former Confederate soldiers or generals or politicians be targets for either imprisonment and or execution. Right? A lot of them believe that they are such traitors to the Union that they need to be completely wiped out. Okay, so even the North is not entirely over this war. They don't really have a good sense of victory in all this. And so a lot of these new questions start coming about now at the end of the war, right? What does it mean to be a citizen? Are we going to grant certain rights to everybody? Right? This is what essentially comes in with all these new amendments during this time period. And who is going to be deserving of all this, right? Are we going to extend this to free persons of color? Are we going to extend this to former Confederates, right? So there's a lot that goes into these questions here. And of course, what rights are we going to give to all Americans, right? If we do allow former slaves, right, these newly emancipated persons of color, are we going to allow them all the rights that Americans, white Americans that is, enjoy? And of course, this patronizing notion of what is to be quote unquote done with free blacks, right? As if they can't do for themselves somehow. Okay, are we going to put them in the same social position as everybody else? Are we going to grant them universal rights? Are we going to deny them certain rights? So there's a lot of responsibility in all this, and the way it's handled is not always done to a very good extent. Again, the South itself has been completely upturned by all this. Again, you see some more of the devastation here in the background, all the cannonballs that are littering the ground here. And most of these are cannonballs that have been fired into buildings, right? You see some of the wagons here in the background. I think this might be a fellow here stooping over to pick up some debris to put it into the backs of these wagons to haul it off. That's essentially how all this was done. By comparison, the northern economy has done extraordinarily well in the face of the war. Okay, between the period of 1860 to 1870, the North actually sees a 50% growth, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that the North has developed tons and tons of industry to help fight this war. Right, the North is much more well-funded. It's had a lot more planning going into it. And the southern economy, in the meantime, has been completely wiped out. Okay, it's seen a complete 60% drop in its productivity, and again, most of that has to do with the fact that that slavery, the plantation system, and cotton, that little trifecta, has gone completely out the window. The property values of a normal plantation in the South have gone under as well. Okay, the year after the war has ended, we have 81 plantations that are sold at less than 10% of their value in 1860. Okay, so just about everything in the South, most of the wealth that's accumulated in the South is not done so in actual hard currency of any kind. All of the wealth is accumulated in land value. Okay, and when that land can't be worked because the entire economy that surrounds it is no longer viable, then the land is virtually worthless. Okay, so this is a very deeply penetrating destruction of the economy. Okay. Of course, any and all Confederate bonds and any paper money that was printed for the Confederacy during the war went under very quickly and is rendered absolutely worthless after the war is over. Right? Anybody who is invested in the Confederacy is out whatever money they've put into it, and of course, paper money, the Union is not going to recognize that anyway. Most people's personal savings are gone, right? So any and all money that was used in the South during this time period has been completely thrown out. And in some cases, right, Union troops have come onto plantations and have seized property. They've seized viable cotton and taken it north with them. And they've taken it with them to military camps to be used for various things and so forth. So a lot of this stuff has kind of been picked over anyway. And just to give you an idea in hard numbers here, okay, slave investment, the entire scope of slave investment during the course of the war by 1865 was about $4 billion, okay, and that's a big, big amount in 1865, okay. The equivalent in 2019 currency is just under $68 billion, okay, so this would be roughly like a corporation the size of Apple, for instance, completely disappearing off the face of the earth overnight, right? It would leave a gigantic hole in the national economy. Okay, so this is something really big that is completely gone now. In 1860, the South is estimated to have produced about 30% of America's wealth, but by 1870 it only does about 12% because, again, cotton is gone. And there's tons of southern cities that lie completely in ruins, right? Mainly because the Union Army has come through, burned them out, destroyed them. Richmond, Atlanta, and Charleston are three specific examples where the devastation occurred the most. And the other thing, too, is this is the first time we have a war in which weapons are designed to maim even more so than kill. Okay, so we have several soldiers now who have lost limbs because of mortars, because of repeating rifles, the Gatling gun, and so forth. It's estimated that about a fifth of the Mississippi state budget in 1866 was spent on prosthetic limbs for soldiers returning from war. Okay, so this was a really another new thing that people hadn't really considered. And of course, the status of the Confederacy itself is under question, right? All the Confederate states, there's 11 Confederate states in total, right? And now we have to decide what to do with each one of these states in order to allow it to come back into the Union or not. For one thing, Abraham Lincoln, who is still the president at the end of the war, okay, argues that secession itself is illegal, right? He says that this is not something where the Confederacy is legitimized in any way. He doesn't view it as being a separate country, although that's what Confederates wanted to happen. He says it's not a conquered territory. It's an area filled with traitorous individuals that is now, essentially under martial law. Okay. And Lincoln believed that the president was going to be the one responsible for rebuilding those state governments and essentially for rebuilding the country as a whole. Again, the question of emancipated slaves becoming citizens or not is another big thing in all this, right? Because in certain areas like South Carolina, for instance, the vast majority of the population are slaves. Okay, I think it's roughly 60% of the population of South Carolina at the end of the war were black slaves that are now emancipated. And the biggest goal of freed slaves in all this is to try to enter into a state of self-reliance, right? Trying to actually build up their own ability to find work, to own land, to own property, to build homes, to reunite themselves with their families and so forth. All these are really, really essential goals to the American dream in general, and of course to individuals who have been completely denied this, again, for several decades, several generations. And like I said, things like controlling their own labor, having family reunions, right, being able to marry, right, that's something that was been completely denied to slaves for several decades, okay. Gaining an education, in many instances this was punishable by death, okay. And of course having a say in political participation too, right? Having the right to vote or the right to voice your opinion in politics. This is something completely denied them as well. And of course just having a social and community life outside of the shared experience of bondage. Anytime in history that we see the executive branch and the legislative branch start to come to blows with one another over some sort of federal policy or some sort of rights of any kind, it usually doesn't go very well, and most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time, the legislative branch is the one that ends up winning out. Okay, and this is one of the first big instances that we start to see here. Okay. At the very beginning of the Civil War, Lincoln already is starting to make plans for how he wants this to end, for how he wants the war to conclude. Okay? And his plan in all this in 1862 is to do essentially what ends up getting done after the war ends and after he is assassinated. And that is to take Union Army generals and install them as military governors, for the time being anyway, in Confederate territory. In 1863, he comes up with something that has been nicknamed the 10% Plan. It's called the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction. Okay? And what this is it's a very, very lenient way of approaching Reconstruction. What he says is that if Confederate states, if 10% of the individuals living in Confederate states, right, 10% of the people who voted in 1860, okay, in 1865, the vote didn't really include anybody from the Confederacy because the Confederacy, separated themselves off. The last time the country was unified was 1860. Okay, if 10% of the people who voted in 1860 swear allegiance to the Constitution and the Union, then those states will be allowed to recreate a Union government. Now, this is, again, very, very lenient because this is a very vast minority of people. Okay, if 90% of a state still is Confederate sympathizers, right, then that's going to cause bigger problems in the future, right? It doesn't sound like this is going to work very well. Okay, Lincoln says he's going to grant a presidential pardon for any ordinary citizens, right? So if you were an individual living in the Confederate South, if you were conscripted to fight, if you didn't want part of it, even if you did want part of it and you did support what the Confederacy did, he's going to basically say you're off the hook. Okay. He's not going to grant any pardon for Confederate government officials, right? Anybody who had any inner dealings with the Confederacy. Anybody who was a senior officer of the Confederate Army or their Navy, which they really didn't have. And anybody who was a judge, a congressman, a military officer who had any kind of government duty in the Union and walked away from it to join the Confederacy. Okay, so anybody who was, in essence, a traitor. Okay? None of these individuals are going to gain a presidential pardon of any kind. And finally, anybody who abused any captured African American soldiers. Okay? And likely this extends also to Union individuals as well, because toward the end of the war, right, the Confederacy got so desperate that they actually began to draft black soldiers. Okay? And African Americans at this period in the Confederacy were viewed as property. Okay? They weren't viewed as actual human individuals. So this is another strange loophole that Lincoln has to cover in order for all this to work. Meanwhile, Congress is largely populated by a group known as the Radical Republicans. Okay, this is a group that is still part of Abraham Lincoln's political party. Okay, the Republicans and the Democrats in 1865 are virtually polarized in terms of their ideas and everything compared to what they are now. Okay, so the Republicans during this period, during 1865, would have been individuals who were much more progressive, much more liberal, and Democrats were much more conservative and much more concerned with states' rights. Okay, so it's the exact opposite of what we know today. And these radical Republicans believed that Congress should be the one to oversee Reconstruction, that the legislative branch, the group that actually makes the laws in government, should be the ones to actually oversee all this. Okay, and so they actually are the ones who end up butting heads with Lincoln here. They believe that all ex-slaves should be granted complete and full citizenship rights. They believe that slavery is not just a bad thing, but a sin, right? Something that is inherently wrong and needs to be completely undone and needs to be made up for. And they also believe that this planter aristocracy in the South, most of whom are supporters of the Democratic Party, right, in the grand scheme of things here. Okay, again, the Democratic Party at this period was the much more conservative group. Okay, they believe that this planter aristocracy, the people who controlled most of the wealth in the South, in cotton and so forth, that they need to be completely gotten rid of and replaced by small farmers and wage workers. Basically, anybody who was kind of pushed aside, right? The 90% of people living in the South who made a lot less money than the planter aristocracy, and in some cases, individuals who might have owned one or two slaves, but were still pushed aside because they weren't from a wealthy family, they weren't in politics and all this kind of stuff. So the discrepancy between individuals who did and did not own slaves is actually quite a bit bigger than what is normally depicted in popular media and so forth. It's estimated about 25% of the people in the South owned slaves, and 75% did not. Okay, so it's a bigger discrepancy than we think. 1864, the radical Republicans passed what they call the Wade-Davis bill, and this is their reaction to the 10% plan that Lincoln has come up with. Okay, they say that a majority of white males living in the South. Okay, and that little caveat there, the white males part, is specific to the fact that Confederates believed that only white males living in the South were ones who were considered citizens. Okay, African Americans were not considered citizens, and even white women were not considered citizens of the Confederacy. Okay, so this language is specifically dictated toward the Confederacy. Okay. But the Wade-Davis bill says a majority of white males living in a former Confederate state have to swear allegiance. This is kind of a fail-safe, right? Making sure that these people are actually on board with all this. And Lincoln thinks that this is something that's too harsh. He thinks that if we come down too hard on them, they're going to push away from us, that they are not going to actually come back into the fold as easily. Okay, and the Republicans, meanwhile, the radical Republicans in Congress think that Lincoln is exceeding his authority. They think that he's trying too hard to overpower them. Okay, so again, we've got the executive branch with Lincoln and the legislative branch with Congress starting to kind of fight a little bit about this. One of the good things that does come out of Reconstruction, even though it doesn't last extremely long, is something called the Freedmen's Bureau. Okay? Basically, what this has to do with is the immediate humanitarian response to emancipated slaves leaving plantations, in many cases leaving the South. Many of them, of course, have no property to speak of, right? Maybe just the clothes on their back, and that's it. Okay, so what this does is initially charity workers end up mobilizing to the South, bringing supplies, bringing all kinds of stuff to try to give something to these individuals who essentially have nothing to start with in their free lives. Okay, and the problem with this, though, is these little individual charities can only go so far. Right, this is being completely outpaced. The need is outpacing what can be done. Okay, and so the federal government ends up having to step in. Okay, in March of 1865, the War Department creates a brand new branch that it refers to as the Freedmen's Bureau, and its sole purpose is to provide humanitarian aid to recently freed slaves. Okay, and this is the first time that the federal government is extending any kind of welfare assistance, if you want to refer to it that way, to people rather than putting the responsibility on the states. Okay. And the reason it does this, of course, is because each of the states in the South has no intention of providing any of this, right? Many of them are still populated by white supremacists who would just as soon spit on a recently freed African American than lend them any kind of hand. Okay, so the federal government is directly stepping in here for the very first time. It's headed by General Oliver Howard. Okay, he's the commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau, and his responsibility is to oversee several little branches of this in the South. And it's a very dangerous job to have because, again, there's plenty of people in the South who are in complete opposition to this. They will sometimes hunt down agents of the Freedmen's Bureau if an individual is assigned with setting up a branch in a remote area. They have kind of a target on their backs. Okay, some of them go into the piney woods or the swamps in the South somewhere, and they never come back. Okay, so this is a very dangerous job to have. But the Freedmen's Bureau, again, provides things like medical care, food and clothing. They do build several schools, although these schools are segregated at this point. And in some cases, they even help negotiate employment contracts to guarantee that African Americans will get jobs after they leave. And in some cases, they even do something like they'll reunite families, they'll actually oversee marriages and so forth. By 1870, there's 4,000 new schools built in the South with almost 250,000 students. Right? So again, this is something that is the complete opposite of what African Americans have been allowed to do. And as I said before, families are being reunited. One of the policies during slavery was to separate husbands and wives, parents and children. So these may have been individuals who haven't seen each other for years or even decades and are now being completely reunited. Okay? And marriage was something that was outlawed as well, just like education was. So now that the Freedmen's Bureau has been set up, these new marriages can be legalized, and individuals who have been kind of common law partners, maybe for years or decades, now have the official recognition of the law in their marriage. As I said before, too, the other big thing that ex-slaves are really after is what is essentially the American dream, right? To own a piece of land, to be able to fend for themselves. And the dream of land ownership is something that is almost always just out of reach for many of them. In some cases, as I said before too, when the Union Army came through during the end of the Civil War and was told that slaves are now emancipated and so forth, in many instances the soldiers would seize the property, the plantations, the cotton, etc., and would actually turn it over to the control of the slaves who had lived and worked there for so long. Okay, and of course the plantation owners themselves are kind of thrown out, on their butts because of this. Right, they're basically told you don't have control of this anymore. And now there begins to be this false rumor that gets circulated, and this is the beginning of Civil War reparations, or the rumor of Civil War reparations, something that, at least up until the time of this recording, is something that has never fully been realized yet. Okay, and this rumor is that each former slave will receive 40 acres and a mule after they are emancipated. Okay, so this is something that gets kind of distributed by word of mouth from one plantation to the next, and it's not always something that is followed through. Okay, certain Union troops just kind of make the decisions in the spur of the moment. Okay, so this blanket guarantee of being granted property and in addition to freedom is not something that ever actually happens. One individual who comes from this time period is Major Martin Delaney. He's the highest ranking officer in the U.S. colored troops. He was a Virginia-born freeman, so he never was a slave himself. But he stresses that the efforts of black resistance, right, slave uprising, and so forth from within is what has done more to guarantee emancipation than any efforts by Abraham Lincoln or Congress or anybody else. And in some ways, he's actually right? Even though the federal government does legitimize these things in a certain way, the individual efforts of African Americans are what actually ends up creating the fear in Southern whites that one day this will actually happen. Okay, and this is something that has been a fear in the backs of Southern whites' minds for the better part of a century by now. Okay, and now their worst fears are coming true. And the other thing that Delaney says is that if freed slaves are not careful, they can be conned back into a slavery system again. Right, even though slavery has been essentially outlawed, there are still loopholes that Southern whites, that is, can employ to get African Americans back into the system. And more often than not, that's exactly what happens. Okay, and these contracts that recently emancipated people end up coming into contact with, they guarantee them room and board, a place to stay, land to work, and so forth. And it's essentially the same thing, right? You are essentially working the land that you've been working your entire life. You might get a little bit of money out of it, but again, if you leave the property or anything like that, in some cases there are no wages at all, right? Sometimes you're just given room and board and that's it. You're given food and maybe some clothing. You might be required to give part of the crop as payment, as like rent of some kind. But if you end up violating the quote-unquote rules of this contract, for instance, if you leave the property without permission or something like that, there is a forfeiture of these quote-unquote benefits. In other words, you're completely kicked off and you're not allowed back. Okay, and this is the beginning of the sharecropping institution. This is something that happens from the end of the Civil War, in some cases all the way into the 1930s and 1940s. Okay, so it's not something that goes away anytime soon, unfortunately. Rewinding back a little bit now, we have to kind of go back to the last couple of months of the Civil War to actually see how Lincoln's fate unfolds. Okay. In April of 1865, Lincoln has already been reelected to the presidency. Okay, and Southerners, of course, are completely up in arms over this. They already seceded immediately after he was elected the first time. And in April of 1865, he delivers the last public address that he has, saying that now that Reconstruction is about to occur, okay, now that the war is in its final stages, the war actually ends in May of 1865, so he doesn't actually live to see its full end actually come about. But he says that he wants no bloody work in Reconstruction, right? He's trying to be eternally optimistic here. Unfortunately, John Wilkes Booth is actually standing in the audience as he's giving this speech, okay, and Booth 3 days later comes into the presidential box, which is completely unguarded at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., and fires his little derringer here into the back of Lincoln's head. Okay, and Booth is actually a young actor. He's in his 20s, has acted at Ford's Theater before. He's a very dramatic individual. Okay, and of course he's a Southern sympathizer, right? He's a sympathizer with the Confederacy. Lincoln manages to linger for several hours thereafter and actually doesn't die until I think about 9 hours after he's shot. If you go onto the Smithsonian Institute's website, there is actually a link to Lincoln's death mask. You can actually see how his face looked at the moment of his death. Someone actually did a plaster cast of his face. I don't believe that it shows the wound in the back of his head. I think they probably censored that somehow, but you can actually see every line in his face and everything. It's very fascinating to see. In the immediate aftermath of Booth shooting Lincoln, he ends up stabbing a military aide, which I assume the artist of the picture here in the background probably means to be this fellow over here. Ironically, this is the same day that the Secret Service is put into effect for the first time. Okay, their first day on the job, they can't prevent the president from being assassinated. So again, kind of an ironic situation here. Sadly ironic. He shoots Lincoln. He jumps off of the balcony onto the stage, and this is probably about 10 feet up in the air. But the thing that is kind of ironic about this as well is there is actually an American flag hanging just underneath the lip of this little balcony here. So when he jumps over the side, he doesn't see this until he catches his leg on the flag and falls on the stage and breaks his leg. He shouts out the phrase "Sic semper tyrannis," which is a Latin phrase that basically means "thus always to tyrants." Right? He's got to have a flair for the dramatic here, and then he takes off out the door. And as I said before, Lincoln dies about 9 hours later. Okay, so it's a very long and arduous thing, right? He doesn't actually it's not a quick death. John Wilkes Booth is actually caught about 11 days later. His leg is set by one of his co-conspirators. He's trapped inside of a barn, which is then set on fire. He ends up running out, and federal authorities shoot and kill him. Okay, so he actually has a quicker death than Lincoln does. The aftermath of Booth's death leads to the unfolding of what eventually turns out to be a conspiracy. Okay, a conspiracy not just to assassinate Lincoln, but also to assassinate other members of his cabinet. Okay, and so you have individuals like Lewis Powell here, this young fellow here. He's only in his 20s. Powell attempts to assassinate William Seward, the Secretary of State. Okay, and Seward at this point is actually recovering from a carriage accident. He's actually in bed in his home with a bandage over his face. Powell breaks in, gets all the way to his bedside with a knife, tries to slash Seward in the face with it, and actually ends up missing because it hits the bandage. Seward manages to fight back before Powell is actually apprehended by other guards and taken away. George Atzerodt is a more pitiful attempt at assassination. He's tasked with assassinating Andrew Johnson, the vice president. And instead, what Atzerodt does is he actually goes to an inn in Washington, D.C., where Johnson is actually staying, and sits at the bar at the bottom of the inn, starts drinking, waiting for Johnson to come down the stairs, and he drinks and he drinks and he drinks. He gets drunk, passes out, and forgets what he's there for. So he's actually caught not too long thereafter. He actually completely misses Johnson altogether. The most tragic of all this is Mary Surratt. Mary Surratt is an individual who only operates the boarding house where John Wilkes Booth stays. That's her only real link that we know of to this entire thing. But because she gave room and board to Booth, right, the federal government targeted her for being a co-conspirator. And sadly, she sets the precedent for being actually the first woman hanged by the federal government for her role in all this. However minor and most likely, unassuming that it was. And finally, David Harold is the fellow who actually sets Booth's leg after he jumps onto the stage and breaks it. Okay, so he actually did specifically help Booth get away in all this. So again, whether or not he actually knew anything about what Booth had done, that part is kind of up in the air as well. So Surratt and Harold seem to be ones who may or may not have had direct compliance in all this. In most cases, Lincoln's death is very much lamented. Right? Of course, he's a very popular president. A lot of people liked him just on a personal level. He had a very personable attitude, was very easygoing, liked to joke. But in some cases, people actually ended up celebrating his death. Most of the people in the South, for instance, were actually thrilled with the fact that he was gone. Okay? His body lay in state in Washington, D.C. for several days before he was buried on May 4th in Springfield, Illinois. This is where you can find him today. In Philadelphia, he had 300,000 mourners and 500,000 in New York City. Okay, so this was a very big, long event where his body was transported from major city to major city for various ceremonies before he was actually laid to rest. So now Andrew Johnson has been pushed into the presidency after Lincoln has died. Okay. And Johnson is a very, very different person and a very, very different president than Lincoln was. Okay, for one thing, Johnson is actually introduced into the president's cabinet during his re-election. Right, so the election of 1865, Lincoln brings Johnson in because Johnson is a Democrat. Right, even though Lincoln himself was a Republican. Okay, so Lincoln's whole idea here was to try to bring in someone from the opposite political party to try to unite the country politically in this regard. Okay, and in a more, I guess, a less altruistic way, it was to help Lincoln ensure that he was reelected. Okay, and Johnson has a laundry list of character defects. Okay, he's known for being very insecure, for being heavily prejudiced against women, being heavily prejudiced against African Americans, and for drunkenness as well. Okay, so he's not the most stable individual, you can put it that way. And he identifies himself as a Jacksonian Democrat. Okay, so just about all of his policies concerning politics and so forth are related to the way that Andrew Jackson presented the Democratic Party from the beginning. Okay, and again, very different from the way the Democratic Party is today. Okay, the whole idea here is that Johnson believes that the Southern elite are individuals that should be targeted for prejudice against them. Right? He doesn't like the Southern elite, and he supports what he calls the common man's democracy. And the common man, in his idea, are Southern white males who are part of the working class. Right? People who don't make as much money and who are kind of put down by Southern wealthy whites. And he is in direct opposition to what the radical Republicans want in terms of industrializing the South, of remaking the South in the way that the North is. And he thinks that small government is going to be the best way of doing this. Okay, so again, the small government idea is something that, in the 20th century anyway, has been directly associated with the Republican Party. After Johnson moves into the presidency, once Lincoln is assassinated, he tries to undo a lot of different things that Lincoln does, or at least tries to take him in a different direction. Okay? He says that he wants to remove all presidential pardons from anybody who's a Southerner who has property worth more than $20,000, so anybody who is extremely wealthy, right? $20,000 is a lot back then. And he wants to prosecute Robert E. Lee, right? The leading general of Confederate forces. And the only person who talks him out of this is Ulysses S. Grant, right? The guy who's in charge of Union forces, right? Grant and Lee both have kind of this amicable gentleman's agreement between the two of them. They have a lot of respect for one another. And Grant comes out and says, "I'm going to completely quit my job if you do this." And Grant, of course, is a war hero at this point, right? He is the one in charge of Union troops during the war. He's the one in charge of actually securing a lot of Union victories. So for him to step out of office would be a really big blow to Johnson's reputation. And the other thing that Johnson decides to do is he goes completely against his policy of being a Jacksonian Democrat, in that he decides he is going to pardon most Southern white aristocrats rather than prosecute them, again, just so he can secure re-election. The restoration plan that Johnson comes up with for Reconstruction is that he is going to basically follow through with some of what Lincoln does, but again, he's going to change up a few things. Okay? Main thing is he is going to get Unionists appointed as provisional governors of Southern states. So all of the former Confederate states, there was 10 of them at this point. One of them, I can't remember which state offhand, but one of them had already been readmitted to the Union. The remaining 10, though, he's going to enact martial law and put Union officers in charge of those states. Each state convention is required to ratify the 13th Amendment, right? This is what puts the Emancipation Proclamation into official terms, right? This is what outlaws slavery altogether. So each one of the southern states has to do this before they can be readmitted into the Union. And the conventions in these southern states are encouraged, they're not required, but are encouraged to give educated and or military African Americans voting rights, just so that Republican demands can be kind of diffused a little bit. Okay, and unsurprisingly, most states in the South completely ignore this, right? Because again, they still have white supremacy very heavily entrenched in all this. Now we have kind of a renewal of this little feud between the executive branch and the legislative branch. Again, now we have a new president, though. Okay, and the radical Republicans in Congress, the legislative branch, right, are led by Thaddeus Stevens, who you see here in an artist's depiction in the background. Okay, and Thaddeus Stevens is known for being kind of this very intelligent and very eloquent speaker. He's known for being very good at insults, for example. Okay, and he's a guy who is, again, initially supportive of Johnson's plans until we start to see things start to bleed through. Okay, primarily the fact that Andrew Johnson is still a white supremacist in all this. Okay, here's Stevens. The radical Republicans end up gaining a majority in Congress in 1865. Okay, so they actually, immediately after Lincoln is reelected, the radical Republicans gain the majority in Congress, and so now they are directly opposed to this Democratic president who wants to essentially undo most of what Lincoln does. Okay. Johnson goes out of his way, though, to try to take control of the situation, again, trying to put the executive branch over the legislative branch. Doesn't turn out very well. December 4th of 1865, Johnson publicly announces, without any kind of input from Congress, that the South is going to be completely restored to the Union without question. Okay? And the radical Republicans in Congress are vehemently opposed to this. They absolutely hate this idea. Okay? And they say we are not going to allow any one of these rebel officials to come back. Right? These states are going to have to ratify certain things in order to be allowed back into all this. And so the radical Republicans set out to develop their own Reconstruction plan. Okay? And this is where Reconstruction starts to move out of the hands of the president and into the hands of the radical Republicans in Congress. 2 days later, Congress passes the 13th Amendment. Okay? And 13th Amendment, again, legitimizes the Emancipation Proclamation. This is Alexander Stephens, by the way. He's one of the former Confederates who Johnson actually allows back into Congress. I just don't have a good transition for that. Sorry about that. Meanwhile, Johnson retaliates by against the 13th Amendment being passed, essentially by vetoing the Freedmen's Bureau for trying to do away with it. Okay, and again, the Freedmen's Bureau is set up, again, kind of as this charitable organization within the federal government, and Johnson is basically saying, no, we're going to cut that off. And so now Johnson and the Democrats start to look at the Civil War, trying to spin it a different way, saying that this is something that is not fought over slavery, but is in fact something fought over states' rights instead. And it's he's very much splitting hairs here, because if you look back at all of the specifics of the Civil War, okay, everything points back to slavery being the primary issue. Okay, and even still, in the South, here in the United States, there are certain schools, there are certain places where the Civil War is still referred to as the War of Northern Aggression, and it's a very unfortunate spin that has its origins at this point in time. Okay, it's not something where the South was completely innocent of any crimes or anything like that. The South refused to do away with an agricultural system that depended on slavery, refused to adapt it in any way, and so eventually it ran afoul of the rest of the country. In March of 1866, the first Civil Rights Act is passed in the United States. This grants citizenships to all natural-born individuals in the United States except for Native Americans. Okay? And sadly, Native Americans are actually not given full citizenship in the United States until 1924. So this is actually, again, another ironic system that we see in place. Johnson also comes against this. He tries to veto the bill, saying that it discriminates against whites, and he says that it favors, quote, lazy former slaves. Okay, so he makes no bones about his opinions in all this. And thankfully, Congress votes highly enough to override his veto, and they put it into effect anyway. The Civil Rights Act doesn't really have a whole lot of teeth to it is the problem. It doesn't really go very far. Most of that has to do with the fact that individuals in the South, white vigilantes in particular, began to attack and kill people in riots. Okay, and sometimes it's even the policemen in the South who begin doing this. Right, they begin attacking and killing African Americans in particular. They also start targeting Republicans living in the South. So we start to see a lot more sectarian violence coming even after the Civil War has ended. This is where a lot of this kind of guerrilla warfare begins to come into play more often than not. And Andrew Johnson is the one who is particularly blamed for this. A lot of his racist rhetoric is what ends up fueling the fire. The Black Codes are another instance that unfortunately has its origins in Reconstruction. Okay, and in the first 2 years immediately following the Civil War, this is a system that was put into place by Southern state legislatures to say that even if we cannot legally put blacks back into a system of slavery, we can do everything we can to make their lives as miserable as possible. Okay, so we can dehumanize them, we can strip them of certain rights that are not covered by these different civil rights laws that exist, and it's ways to basically just kind of pour lemon juice on the paper cut, right? And obviously not to underplay that at all. This is much worse than that. And the whole goal of this is to try to restore white supremacy in the South, right? To add insult to injury as much as possible. That's what I'm getting at. In many instances, African Americans are not allowed to vote. Of course, this is something that doesn't happen until we get to the 15th Amendment. They're not allowed to serve on juries or in any kind of state militias. They cannot testify against whites in court. They cannot attend public schools unless there are schools that are specifically designated for blacks. And even then, in some cases, the state legislatures override those rules. In certain states like Mississippi, they can't even own farmland. Okay. In many cases, if they are going to own farmland, they have to be apprenticed to a white man, preferably someone who used to own them as slaves. In South Carolina, they cannot own city property. In Alabama, they can't even own a gun. Okay, so if they have to hunt to survive, they have to find other ways of doing it. And even here in Texas, they can't marry whites or hold elected office. Right? Texas is still kind of an outlier at this point in terms of the Confederacy. It's on the frontier of all this, but it still began as a slave state, unfortunately. And all blacks, regardless of their status, legal status, are required to sign an annual labor contract to provide proof to the federal government, or to the state governments at the very least, that they are employed. And if they're not, if they don't have a job at the end of each year, then they're hunted down and jailed as vagrants. Okay, so again, these states are going to find all kinds of different ways to try to disenfranchise them. And if they are put into debtors' prisons, vagrant prisons, or whatever, put into prison for vagrancy, let's put it that way, then they are actually put into a system of being part of a chain gang. In other words, they, as prisoners, they are hired out to work for free for Southern whites in chains. Another form of slavery, you might think. Okay? And again, this also works in the advantage of prisons because it requires them, a prisoner requires money to be able to sustain them. Okay? And if you have to hold a bunch of prisoners in a certain prison, you have to spend money to do it. Okay? So to hire them out and have them work and or live on a plantation, right, it works out in the advantage of the plantation owners because now they have free labor, and it works out to the benefit of the prisons because now they don't have to pay for prisoners. And again, this convict leasing system is, again, just like sharecropping, it's another very thinly disguised form of slavery. And chain gangs, you see this go all the way into the 20th century, again, into the 30s and the 40s, just like sharecropping. And of course, the radical Republicans in Congress and Republicans in general, in most cases, are completely outraged by this, by these attempts to override what the federal government is doing. That's what the Civil War, in a very technical way, was fought over to begin with. Again, not just states' rights over the federal government, but slavery and all this tied together. The next step that the federal government takes is to pass the 14th Amendment. Okay. In April of 1866, the Congressional Joint Committee on Reconstruction proposes a 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which is supposed to guarantee citizenship to anyone born or naturalized in the United States. Okay. Again, except for Native Americans, right? This is kind of taking that Civil Rights Act of 1866 and putting it into a much more official capacity. It also, ostensibly anyway, prohibits any efforts to violate the citizens' civil rights of any citizens, regardless of their skin color. No one can deprive a person of any life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Again, ostensibly, this is undercut in many ways. And everyone is supposed to be granted equal protection under the law. Okay, again, ostensibly, this is something that the South has no intention of complying with, unfortunately. And again, this puts the responsibility of the protection and enforcement of individuals' civil rights onto the federal government. Okay, so the federal government is directly stepping into this and bypassing state laws. It's approved by Congress in June of 1866, and unsurprisingly, no Democrats end up supporting it because, again, the Democratic Party at this point, many of them are still Confederate sympathizers. And Andrew Johnson, meanwhile, is losing a lot of support and begins to openly insist that America is a country for white men, quote unquote. He says that this is something that he's becoming thinner and thinner in his attempts to conceal any efforts at white supremacy. He's starting to openly state it. And in 1866, the elections result in a 2/3 majority of Republicans, both in the Senate and in the House. Okay, so now the legislative branch is so chock full of Republicans that they can oppose Johnson very quickly and end his influence over Reconstruction. Now Congress starts to take charge of things. Okay. In March of 1867, Congress starts to pass its own Congressional Reconstruction Acts. Okay. First thing that it does is pass what it calls the Military Reconstruction Act, and this is the follow-through of what Lincoln wanted to do from 1862 for the end of the war. Okay. It divides the South into 5 different state districts, okay, to try to basically install a military governor over each one of these districts to ensure that they are now compliant with new laws. Okay. It abolishes all new governments in rebel states that are under Johnson's Reconstruction policies, so it takes all of Johnson's authority out of the equation. Right? He's not allowed to make these decisions anymore because they don't trust him. It also establishes a lot of congressional military control. Okay, so again, 10 of the 11 states that used to be part of the Confederacy, all the ones that you see here in all these different colors. Tennessee was the 11th, but it actually went back to Union control immediately following the war in 1866. So it's not actually under this particular policy. So again, a Union general is in charge of each one of these districts. And now new state constitutions have to be rewritten, guaranteeing suffrage for all adult males, white and black, and they have to have input from both white and black men. They have to be penned by both. Okay, so this guarantees that all efforts at white supremacy are pushed out of the way, at least, again, ostensibly. And the states are now required to ratify not only the 13th Amendment, but now the 14th Amendment as well, right, to receive any kind of congressional representation. So for them to have representatives from any one of these southern states, they have to have the 14th Amendment ratified. Next thing is the Command of the Army Act. This basically says that any decisions made through Army orders stops with Ulysses S. Grant. Everything has to be approved by him. He's given total control over any and all military decisions. Okay, if Johnson wants to issue any kind of Army orders or anything like that, Grant has to approve them first. And again, this prevents Johnson from appointing any kind of military governors himself or anybody who is any one of his supporters. Right, prevents him from having an unfair advantage. And the Tenure of Office Act is another thing that gets passed. This requires that the president is not allowed to fire anybody in his cabinet without approval from the Senate. Okay? So the Senate has to oversee everything, essentially, that the president does here. And a lot of modern pundits, anyway, in politics, argue that this was essentially baiting Johnson up for a trap. Okay, and in many ways it may very well have been, right? People knew just how quarrelsome he was. They knew what his leniency or what his tendency was in this particular case. And a lot of it surrounds the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. Okay, Edwin Stanton was Secretary of War under Lincoln and was a supporter of Lincoln, but now that he is working under Johnson, he sees what Johnson is doing, and he does not support Johnson at all. In fact, he's one of Johnson's biggest, most vocal opponents. And, of course, Johnson doesn't like Stanton either. Okay, and Stanton was coming under such heavy fire from Johnson that most people believe that, well, Johnson is probably going to try to fire him soon. Okay, so by putting this system in place, if Johnson violates any one of these 3 congressional acts, then he can be the target for impeachment. And that's exactly what happens. From 1867 to 1868, radical Republicans look at what Johnson is doing and they realize that he is in direct opposition to what Congress is trying to do with Reconstruction, right? He is in violation of Congress. He's obstructing Congress. This is a little out of order. Sorry about that. Edwin Stanton is fired by Johnson. So Johnson takes the bait, if you want to think of it in those terms. Okay, Johnson fires Stanton, tries to replace him with Ulysses S. Grant, and now Johnson is in direct violation of the Tenure of Office Act. He's broken the law. And so now Johnson becomes the target for impeachment. Okay, and impeachment is a term that you hear a lot these days. Okay, to explain it, basically what this is Congress determines that the president is guilty of quote-unquote high crimes and misdemeanors. What this basically means is if the president has somehow violated a legislative law, something that has been put into place in this country, has violated the law in some way, whether as in a crime or in a misdemeanor capacity. Okay. Once the House of Representatives determines whether or not the president is to be impeached, the next step is the Senate takes control of the situation, the higher seat of Congress. Okay, and they determine by a 2/3 majority vote if the president should be removed from office or not. February of 1868, the House passes 11 articles of impeachment against Johnson, okay, guaranteeing that he is going to be impeached. Okay. He is being indicted for high crimes and misdemeanors by the House of Representatives. By March, right, only a couple of weeks later, the first Senate trial of a sitting president commences. Okay, and you see the artist rendering of it here in the background. Okay, Johnson is allowed to call witnesses to his defense to determine whether or not he is going to be removed from office. And this is almost a bargaining situation. The president can still remain in office if he agrees to abide by the law, if he agrees to cease and desist all efforts of obstruction, which is kind of the core of what Johnson is accused of here. The trial lasts for 5 weeks. It ends with a conviction. Right? He is convicted of obstructing Congress, but only one vote comes out in support of him, or one vote short of him being removed from office. So he remains in office as president, but his powers are very greatly decreased after that. Okay, and the only thing that really guarantees that he remains in office is he agrees to stop obstructing Congress, to stop any efforts at taking the helm on Reconstruction for himself. And this actually ends up having the opposite effect when it comes to congressional Reconstruction, because the public suddenly, and most of the public being the South in this case, most of whom are, again, Democrats, Confederate sympathizers who like what Johnson is doing, right? Southern whites in this case, that once he is convicted, now Southern whites begin to do exactly what Lincoln was worried about. They start to oppose congressional Reconstruction. In June of 1868, 8 of the original 11 Confederate states are allowed to send representatives back to Congress. And Virginia, Mississippi, and Texas are finally readmitted in 1870, the remaining 3, after ratifying the 15th Amendment. This is what gives voting rights to black men. And in this particular capacity with the 15th Amendment, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, 2 ladies who were very famous suffragettes during this period, and who were campaigners for women's rights, for equality, and so forth, tried their best to get the federal government to include an amendment or to include a clause within the amendment to extend this right to women as well. But they unfortunately are not able to do so, and women actually don't gain the right to vote until 1920 as a result.